Hello, this is Father Rich coming to you from Our Lady of Peace Church for our next edition of How the Church Has Changed the World. You might recognize this perspective. We used it quite a bit in our walk through the stained glass windows here at Our Lady of Peace, but it really does give you that perspective of the priests and the deacons up in the sanctuary looking out on the beautiful stained glass here at Our Lady of Peace, which when you're in the congregation you might not appreciate as much. But between that and the sunlights that are and sun windows that are put into the church, it really allows for the natural light to light up the church here. And that's really part of a big focus of this essay that we have for this section. It's called "For God is Light." And it talks about a new type of architecture that came about in the 12th century following the Romanesque architecture that had dominated for several centuries, and introduced by a Benedictine monk, the man who's considered kind of responsible for bringing this type of architecture to the next level. He was influenced by some of the architecture and techniques being used in the Near East, but at that time he was called to rebuild as a Benedictine monk. He had followed the call really and been inspired by St. Bernard of Clairvaux himself, who had called for monastic reform in the 12th century. He was the abbot of St. Denis Monastery there in Paris, in France, and named after the patron saint of Paris, Denis, who was martyred, the first bishop of France in the 3rd century. Also remember Dionysius, which is the French for Denis, was the name of that convert we talked about earlier in this series of Paul in Athens, and the first bishop of Athens, Greece, remember. And also there was a Syrian poet who wrote mystically in between about the 2nd century that was really a poet of light, so to speak. And so he was redoing this monastery there in Paris, and he wanted to bring in more light. And so they used several techniques that would eventually become the standards for Gothic architecture. And things like supporting the churches from outside, flying buttresses, pointed arches instead of rounded arches, ribbed vaulting, and slimmer pillars that didn't block things. And so when they found all this support, they were then able to use stained glass windows in the walls. And so it was just trying to increase, it had higher ceilings, increased stained glass windows to let the light in, and then the great ornamentation of the gems and the gold that would really just make it a spectacle of light. And so this is where Gothic architecture started. Now they used the Gothic name for that wasn't started being used. It was just called the work, French work was what it was called when they were doing it, because it originated in France. But then the Renaissance, looking back on Gothic architecture, kind of looking down on it, one of the references was that it was like Germanic, it was barbaric. And the term was Goth, because they were the Goths were barbarian and German barbarians from the 4th and 5th century that really sacked Rome and were considered uncivilized. So it was really a pejorative term, but then it eventually became the term that they used, even though some argue we should have a different title for it, but it stuck. And but it was known for those things. And so some of the things that, and the abbot's name was Abbot Suger. He lived from 1081 to 1155, and he was the one kind of seen in that first church there at St. Denis in Paris that was kind of considered the starter, the founding of Gothic architecture, which really was prominent for the next 4 centuries until 16th century Renaissance architecture kind of took over. So one of the things they mention in the abbot writes in the doors of that church that I thought was really significant, still to this day. It says, "All you who seek to honor these doors, marvel not at the gold and the cost, but at the art. The noble work is bright, but being nobly bright, The work should brighten minds, allowing them to travel through the lights to the true light, where Christ is the true door. The golden door shows how light is immanent in these things. The dull mind rises to the truth through material things and rises from its submersion when it sees the light. So he really saw churches as not just holding works of art, but he wanted to make the church a work of art in itself. And what? To elevate the mind to God. And that's really what churches always tried to do. But certainly he thought the more light that we could bring in, the more it would get us to meditate on Jesus Christ, who is the light, and on the source of all light, which is God himself. Remember in Genesis, we talked about that was the first thing God created. Let there be light, the first active creation of a thing. So we appreciate that. So they really wanted to see it as a work of art. And then later on, when the Abbots, Suger, would get a chance to go into and pray at that same church that he built, this is what he would talk about in the sense of what the church could help do in your relationship with God in prayer. Thus sometimes when, because of my delight in the beauty of the house of God, the multicolored loveliness of the gems has called me away from external cares and worthy meditation, transporting me from material to immaterial things, has persuaded me to examine the diversity of holy virtues. Then I seem to see myself existing on some level, as it were, beyond our earthly one, neither completely in the slime of earth, nor completely in the purity of heaven. So the church, in helping us to meditate and kind of pulling us out, if you will, into another level of existence and being, and so that we can do the work of Jesus Christ and to bring his light to the world. So really a fascinating chapter. This is the conclusion. St. Bernard would write about Abbot Suger, who built that beautiful church when he died. If there is any precious vase adorning the palace of the King of Kings, it is the soul of the Venerable Suger. And then the conclusion, which I'll leave you with these words as well of the essay: let us too aspire to be art for God. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day. God bless.